All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we are unpacking what is easily one of the most vital slave narratives in American history, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Published back in 1861 by Harriet Jacobs, though she used the pseudonym Linda Brent, this book is an absolute game changer. Why? Because it completely breaks the silence on the unique, horrific realities faced by enslaved women. You know, a lot of historical accounts focus on the sheer physical brutality of the institution, which is obviously crucial. But Jacobs gives us this piercing, first-hand look at the intricate psychological warfare and the sexual exploitation that were just baked into slavery.
Right from the very first page, Jacobs actually breaks the fourth wall. She speaks directly to her northern audience, specifically targeting white women, begging them to recognize the profound psychological trauma she and millions of others were living through. She flat out tells us that the horrors she describes, they actually fall short of the real facts. She's not out here writing for pity. No, she's writing to completely shatter the ignorance of people who thought slavery was just unpaid labor. She wants us to really understand the absolute moral degradation it forces onto its victims.
So, Part 1, A Deceptive Childhood.
To really grasp her story, we've got to start in a surprisingly sheltered environment. For the first 6 years of her life, Linda didn't even know she was a slave. It's crazy to think about, right? Her father was a skilled carpenter managing his own affairs, and her parents shielded her so deeply that she never even dreamed she was considered merchandise, property that could be demanded away at any second. This arc, from a deceptive childhood to astonishing isolation, and finally to a frantic escape, maps out the ultimate survivor's journey. But, as we'll see, that childhood illusion gets brutally shattered.
The cold, hard reality of being property hits home when we look at Linda's grandmother. This woman was incredible. She baked crackers late into the night just to scrape together $300, which was a massive fortune back then, all to buy her children's freedom. But guess what? Her mistress just begged for the money as a loan, and because a slave had zero legal standing, the grandmother was utterly defrauded. Under Southern law, property can't own property. She had to trust the honor of a slaveholder, which Jacobs points out with bitter irony was worth absolutely nothing.
Which brings us to Part 2, The Trials of Girlhood.
That childhood innocence? Yeah, it definitely couldn't last. For a free white girl, coming of age was this beautiful pathway blooming with flowers, totally celebrated. But for an enslaved girl like Linda, it just meant prematurely knowing evil. Jacobs makes this heartbreaking observation that if an enslaved girl was beautiful, it wasn't a blessing, it was literally her greatest curse. By the time Linda was just 15, her looks drew the predatory, relentless attention of her master, Dr. Flint, who started whispering foul things to her, constantly reminding her that he owned her body and soul.
Now you might think, surely she could turn to the woman of the house for help. But no, the institution of slavery completely deadens all moral sense. Linda found absolutely no refuge in Mrs. Flint. In fact, the mistress's jealousy only poured fuel on the fire, adding a daily torrent of psychological abuse to Linda's life. Mrs. Flint played the victim, pitying herself as a martyr, while having zero sympathy for the teenage girl her husband was targeting. It just goes to show how every single natural human bond gets poisoned when you introduce ownership of another person.
All right, moving into Part 3, A Mother's Desperate Choice.
So, denied the right to marry a free black carpenter that she truly loved, Linda realizes she has to take drastic measures to escape Dr. Flint's absolute control. And that raises a massive question. How far would a mother go to save her children from the auction block? I really want you to let that sink in for a second, as we look at the radical, heart-wrenching strategies she used. It completely challenges our modern ideas of morality and agency, forcing us to look at the impossible choices made by someone in captivity. Here is what she did to subvert her master. Knowing Dr. Flint would never sell her children if they were his own, she deliberately chose to have an affair with an unmarried white man named Mr. Sands. She calculated that Flint's pride wouldn't let him claim another man's kids, and she hoped Sands might eventually just buy their freedom. She admits this to the reader with such a heavy heart, begging the sheltered women of the North not to judge her too harshly. For Linda, choosing a lover felt way less degrading than being forced to submit to Dr. Flint. It was a profound act of rebellion masquerading as a moral fall.
This leads right into Part 4, 7 Years in Hiding.
Eventually, Dr. Flint threatened to send her young children to the plantation to be broken in. So Linda ran, and this kicks off one of the most unimaginable phases of her life. 7 whole years, she hid herself right under Dr. Flint's nose for 7 years, choosing an agonizing imprisonment of her own making rather than submitting to her abuser. The sheer physical toll of her hiding spot, which she called the loophole of retreat, is just mind-blowing. To stay close to her kids, she hid in a tiny garret right above her grandmother's shed. We're talking 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and at the absolute highest point, 3 feet high. She literally could not stand up. She battled suffocating, extreme heat in the summer, freezing cold in the winter, complete darkness, and swarms of insects. And yet, she tells us she preferred this absolute physical torture over her life as a slave.
She drilled a tiny peephole so she could look out. And through that hole, she endured the unbelievable emotional agony of watching her children grow up just a few feet away. She could hear their sweet voices, watch them play, see them cry, but she couldn't hold them. She couldn't comfort them. For 7 long years, she was basically a ghost in her own children's lives. The only thing keeping her going was this fierce, burning hope that someday she could secure their freedom.
Let's turn to part 5, Escape to the North.
Eventually, she gets a chance to escape by boat. After years in the dark, she makes this incredibly dangerous journey to Philadelphia and then to New York, looking for that fabled northern freedom. But reaching the Free States completely shattered her illusions. She found out pretty quickly that the North just aped the customs of slavery. Traveling meant being forced into filthy, segregated train cars, even when she had paid for a first-class ticket. She realized that prejudice followed her everywhere, and that Northern society was deeply complicit, profiting from slavery and enforcing its social hierarchies. The Mason-Dixon line wasn't some magical boundary where racism just vanished.
Finally, Part 6, The Cost of Freedom.
Even in New York, where she eventually managed to reunite with her kids, she couldn't rest. And this brings us to the final, chilling reality of her story, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Because of this horrific federal law, Linda was constantly hunted by Dr. Flint, and later by his heirs. The law essentially turned the entire North into a hunting ground, penalizing anyone who dared to help a runaway. She lived in this perpetual terror that she or her family would be snatched right off the streets of New York and dragged back into bondage. Literally every knock at the door was a threat.
To keep her safe for good, a Northern friend and employer named Mrs. Bruce finally bought Linda's freedom from Flint's heirs for $300. Now, you'd think this would be a joyous moment, right? But Linda bitterly resented it. She felt completely robbed of her victory. She tells us she worked for her liberty as faithfully as Jacob served for Rachel in the Bible. Yet, in the end, God's image was put on a scale and weighed against a paltry $300. For her, it just validated the grotesque idea that a human being could actually be bought and sold.
We're wrapping up this explainer with Jacobs profoundly subverting the classic happy ending. You know, a typical 19th century novel usually ends in a happy marriage. But Jacobs leaves us with a much more sobering reality. What does freedom actually mean in 1861 America, when she's still haunted, destitute, and doesn't even have a true home of her own? She might not technically be a slave anymore, but she leaves us with this question. Can a person truly be free in a society that fundamentally denies their basic humanity and their right to a secure, independent life? I'll leave you to chew on that.